We'll get started straight away as we don't have much time. So welcome back, everyone. The second panel, as John mentioned, will focus a little bit more sharply on the changing nature of journalism and on ethics and journalism, two themes that Alastair Campbell addressed more specifically in his second lecture last week. The format will remain the same, so we'll give about 10 to 15 minutes to the speakers to basically speak, and then invite Alastair to reply, and then I will open it to the floor. Now, allow me to introduce two speakers now. Angela Phillips is a reader in journalism at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's a journalist and the convener of journalism programs and the chair of the Ethics Committee of Media Reform. She gave evidence to the Levinson inquiry and has written widely on the subject of ethics and journalism. She's the co-editor of Changing Journalism and the author amongst several books, of Journalism in Context. Charlie Beckett is the founding director of POLIS, the London School of Economics, international journalism's think tank based in the Department of Media and Communications. He's the current head of the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. And prior to this, he was an award-winning filmmaker and editor at London Weekend Television, BBC, and ITN. He's the author of several books as well, amongst them Supermedia and WikiLeaks News in the Network Era. So without further ado, Angela.
Hello. As somebody who still sees myself as being a journalist, even though I practice less and do more academic work, I felt I had to at least start by dealing with something that Alastair said in the last session, which, if I was a Daily Mail reporter, I would most certainly have used as the soundbite of the day. The politician has the right to decide what comes out of his mouth. Now, I don't know if there are any other journalists in the audience here, but I wonder whether you really think that journalists should be stenographers?
No.
Or whether they should be the critical...
No, say that.
Oh, you get to speak later.
Okay.
Or whether they should have a rather more critical take. And I think that also comes throws a little bit of a light on the question that was never asked earlier, which is, do you ever, in your moments of real self-criticism, wonder whether forcing the Director General and the chair of the BBC and the editor of the Today programme to resign over a story which in the end turned out to be true, was your finest hour?
No, it didn't.
But you get a chance to come back on that as well.
The short answer is no, and then I'll explain.
Okay. And I think that needed to be said too. But apart from that, I am going to move into slightly different territory. Because a lot of what you had to say I thought was very interesting. And I agreed with a lot of it. Although I worry a little bit about whether or not your position on regulation is quite the same as mine, and whether you would like to see journalists regulated in terms of what they do politically, which I certainly would not. I think that we have to have real freedom of the press alongside a much better understanding of ethics. So that means that people should be able to publish, but at the same time understanding that if they publish, and if what they do is found to be unethical, that they should be held to account. I think it's that way round. But like him, I am also optimistic about the future of journalism, because I believe that democracy requires good journalism, and we will find a way to ensure that we have it. Unlike him, I am realistic about what that means in the struggle ahead, and I want to pick up in particular this one paragraph from his speech. Journalists have to own their journalism, see it as something with codes of behaviour, so that when a news editor instructs them to harass or write what amounts to lies or twist the facts to suit a preordained line they cannot support, they say, "No, I won't." He does point out that it takes courage to stand up to a boss, but courage is what leads to change, he said, and there's been too little of it bottom up from people saying, "This is wrong, not what I came into journalism to do." So in a sense, what you're doing is blaming the journalists at the bottom in the same way as you are very critical of the people, the public, for not behaving as the way the people, the public, ought to behave. And I think that this completely underestimates the reality of the problem, because it assumes that journalists, particularly those at the bottom of the pile, as young journalists tend to be, have not just the courage but the power to stand up to the boss. Now, this is an email that I received from one of my own postgrads who went to work for a tabloid. I've spent this week reporting for, it will remain nameless, and it has strained to breaking point every moral fibre I thought I had. They decide what a story is, then get me to find the facts that fit their narrative. This has happened on at least 3 occasions this week, and they ignore facts or opinions which break the mould. I know this is true to an extent with every news publication, but given my political beliefs, I find it galling. I do not want to do this for a long time, but it's too good an opportunity to turn down at the moment, not least financially. They're getting me in again next week. However, they have said it will be on a week-to-week basis from there on, so I'm doubtful of anything more permanent. Now, that was maybe 18 months ago. And here is one I did earlier. This is from 10 years ago, and this was a journalist I interviewed who was much further into his career. He was talking about his time spent as a reporter on a mid-market popular daily. I thought the story was appalling. I thought all along that it was a ludicrous exercise with no logic whatsoever, and I felt very ashamed about it. I talked to a senior reporter and said I wasn't very happy about it, and he said to keep my head down and say nothing. He said that I'd lose my job if I raised it with anybody more senior than him. I set about planning to leave. I'd just arrived, so I knew I couldn't leave straight away. I kept my head down, I worked hard. I knew it would be at least a year before I could go. I was in a position the same as everyone who joins the paper, from a local newspaper, and that I was doing shifts on a daily basis. And it was up to them to decide whether to renew my job the next day. So if I lost my job, I wouldn't be able to pay the rent or anything like that, which probably isn't an excuse, but there was still that thought there. I'm happy to say that both of these individuals managed to move on to work for news organisations that operate ethically. But they had absolutely no impact on the news organisations they left behind. They merely left a gap for another eager young reporter to fill. The reality is that these people working for popular newspapers are not free to act ethically because, as Bourdieu points out, precarity of employment is a loss of liberty, through which censorship can be more easily expressed. If you are not free to move, to take action, you are not free to act ethically. And this is the absolute crux of the problem. Campbell suggests that the practices of the popular press are dying out. I wish he was right about that. The sad reality is that the Daily Mail, a newspaper we know he does not love, is now one of the most read, if not the most read, it depends on the analytics you read, news organisations in the world. If we look to new entrants into the field, we find BuzzFeed. Anybody here read BuzzFeed? Yay. Its latest analytics indicate that it has an audience of 82 million. That's people, not hits. These were the headlines yesterday in order. 23 moments when you realise that you have failed as a man. 10 things dogs want to be when they grow up. Fatal blasts in Beirut have killed at least 23 people. This is what happened when the Doctor Who people visited Buckingham Palace. That is the exact order of the headlines. Now, BuzzFeed is branching out into more serious journalism. It recently hired Mark Scoofs, later ProPublica, and it now has a team of 130 journalists. Some of them get to cover serious stuff. Most of them find stories about kittens. BuzzFeed works because it is very big, takes social media very seriously, and is very clever indeed at using analytics to work out how best to attract an audience. Because the problem with the internet is that it is not democratizing, it is centralizing. The economics of the web are all about scale. If BuzzFeed, with 82 million readers, can employ 130 journalists, how many journalists can you employ if you're a local news organization with, let's say, 10,000 regular visitors a month? I can tell you, 1. If you work really hard and happen to be in an area where there are lots of places where your readers can book tickets and tables, you might get by. Even then, most of your effort is likely to go into trying to find ways of getting money in, rather than exposing corruption in the town hall. Local websites are rarely economically viable. Most of them still sell newspapers to bring in the ads that pay the bills. Small-scale national sites are no better off. It is the 20pI that's keeping the Independent just about alive. And the Guardian newspaper still provides, not the Guardian newspaper, the print edition, still provides 70% of the Guardian's income, or it might be more. I did that without looking at the figures. Much of the rest is paid for by soulmates. So if you really care about the future of news, start dating online. This matters because scale, viability, diversity are all directly related to ethics. Journalists need to be free to walk out of a job if they are to act ethically. At the moment, all the power in the general news media lies in the hands of a relatively small number of highly commercial news organisations. Smaller scale organisations struggle to compete. Of course, Alastair Campbell says audiences are more vocal. Social media provides everyone with a means of having a say, and I very much welcome No More Page 3, Everyday Sexism, and The Vigenda. I don't know, have any of you seen The Vigenda? It's great. You should have a look. But they are not journalism. They are organised protest about journalism. Now, that is important, but it isn't the same. Journalism is a wonderful career for highly trained, intelligent young people, but they need to be paid. A brave new world in which journalism becomes a hobby is of no interest to them, and quite rightly so. Hobbyists cannot be the specialist reporters that Campbell wants to bring back, and quite rightly so. They can be tenacious researchers of subjects that obsess them, but they won't have the time or the interest to dig around and unearth wrongdoing in somebody else's field. The greater empowerment of the audience is a wonderful thing, and it's good to see bad journalism lampooned. But how much effect do those pinpricks actually have in changing the behaviour of the media behemoths? I mean, really, have we noticed any? Have you looked at the column of shame lately, any of you, on the Daily Mail? How much has that been changed by the very many online sites that are there specifically to lampoon the Daily Mail? I love them, but I bet the average Daily Mail reader doesn't have a look at them. What is required for ethical journalism to flourish is not regulation. It's not even self-regulation, though both would certainly help, as Natalie has said. What is actually required is real diversity. And that is not, to my mind, all about breaking up the big companies. It's about thinking about what's happening underneath, trying to actually focus on what's happening, particularly in the local press. That is going to require, indeed, a new generation, not just of journalists, but of imaginative, media-savvy technologists and business people, who, unlike Zuckerberg and Page, who I was appalled to see you being really nice about,
I said how old he was.
are not what?
I said how old he was.
Okay, they're not in. They are not in it. I mean, what I'd like to see is that people who are not in it just to get bigger at the expense of everybody else, because that's what's happening online. We need to find dozens of different ways of ensuring that good journalism survives. Ways like there's a wonderful French women's magazine that I've just discovered called Corset, if that's how you pronounce it. I hope so. I haven't actually heard anybody say it. But it runs parties to bring in cash. It has adverts, but none of them are paid for. It sells 90,000 copies a month with a cover price of €4.95. And it's a feminist magazine. Or Little White Lies, which we know about because the person who runs it has just come to Goldsmiths to do a PhD. Little White Lies is a really good critical film magazine, but it's completely non-viable on its own. It depends entirely on being part of a little publishing empire to survive. It is almost a vanity publication. But then there are probably better examples. For example, like the West Highland Free Press, which has been there for a long time and is run as a co-op. And because it's run as a co-op and is owned by its staff, it thrives because it does not have its profits creamed off to pay debts or shareholders. And that's what's happened to the rest of the local press. As they've all been gobbled up and consolidated, huge debts have been amassed. And what is actually sinking the local press in this country has indeed sunk quite a lot of the local press in this country, is the level of debt that people are trying to pay off with lower amounts of money coming in. The economics of journalism are pretty ugly at the moment. We are going to need to start again. My optimism lies in the knowledge that there are people who really want to be journalists and will, without any shadow of doubt, come up with clever new ways of doing it and being paid to do it. In the meantime, I would like Alastair to turn his considerable influence and charm towards getting the Labour Party behind a scheme to subsidise entry jobs into innovative, small-scale journalism, using money creamed off by a levy on the likes of Google and Facebook, who feed off journalism without contributing to its future at all. And we can give you chapter and verse on these plans, and we will hope you will become our champion. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much. It's interesting, as I listen through the day to other colleagues, I think increasingly people are actually angry because they can't get the media they want. And if I've got one message, it is that you perhaps can now, actually. And some people might actually want the Mail online. Alastair started his first lecture by saying that he studied here at Cambridge and that he was very chippy when he was at Cambridge. I was actually rejected by Cambridge, so you can imagine how chippy I feel. I'm going to concentrate on just one bit of what Alastair's been talking about, much as I'd love to range wider, which is on the digital bit. I should say that I wrote much too much for this presentation and I've been hacking it back over the last 5 minutes. But if you want to see the full unexpurgated director's cut, then it's on my blog. Just Google Charlie Beckett, and there isn't even a tax on Google for you to do that. It's on the blog now. I think a lot of what Alastair has said about journalism is motherhood and apple pie, albeit a pie that's been laced with arsenic. Yes, we all want more intelligent, fairer, braver journalism, and there are a lot of things out there which are working against it. I'd also say that there's a lot of good stuff out there, especially if you don't concentrate on looking at the British mainstream press. What I want to ask tonight is whether I'm right in that I agree with Alastair in that the best hope is in what academics call the affordances of the internet. Do digital technologies combined with internet platforms or networks offer much hope of a more diverse, informative, useful, challenging news media? As a journalist, like Alastair, I'm convinced that the new generation of journalists, despite the shitty conditions that has been described by people like Angela, have got a remarkable opportunity. The power of the tools, the potential of connectivity, and the fact they're working with a much more sceptical, educated and information-hungry public must be positive. But what about the effect on the kind of public purpose for journalism that Alastair has been talking about in these lectures, and especially with regard to politics? Leaps over contextual section. Where are we now? What's the difference in historical terms? I think that's one way of thinking about this. I don't know if people here are familiar with this idea of the Gutenberg parenthesis, this idea that the whole of printed media history is a blip, an intermission between oral history. Well, I'm not convinced by that thesis, but on a smaller scale, I'd like to think that there is such a thing as an exceptional age of mass media power, and I'm thinking about the UK, that coincided with the last gasp of mass party political strength. And in honour of the Gutenberg parenthesis, I'd like to call it the Campbell bracket. In that sense, I'm including your time at the Mirror, Alastair. So I think we could argue that something like 1974 to 2003 was an exceptional age of mass media power and mass party political strength. Kind of dinosaurs clashing, but very potent dinosaurs. Newspapers and broadcasters had unprecedented resources, thanks to advertising and economic growth, combined with largely pre-internet technological advances in telephony, video, and broadcast reach. At the same time, the two main parties were still buoyed up by relatively high election polling, large party memberships, and a concentration of power in Westminster. The resultant struggle between the political and press behemoths, I love that word, we keep mentioning that, behemoth, what is a behemoth? The political, it's big, whatever it is, it's big and it's nasty. The struggle between these behemoths led to a period where the right-wing press could claim, for example, to have won an election with a front page. And we had spin doctors accused of duping the public into going into a war. And we had an intensely competitive, arrogant culture on both sides that led, in a sense, to phone hacking and MPs' expenses scandals, symptomatic of a much deeper political cultural malaise, with the public excluded, debate diminished, and policy making often made perverse. And people describe this as the Golden Age. This peaked at the very moment that the forces were emerging that would begin its decline through some profound shifts in the way that power's mediated in the UK. In that sense, the work behind the scenes of people like Bernard Ingham, Tim Bell, the late, great Philip Gould and Alastair were attempts to cope with structural social shifts in political mediation. So now both politicians and journalists are in a new historical phase, I would argue, where fundamentals have changed. But should we share Alastair's optimism and mine, perhaps, that we're in a bright new era? Well, to a degree, yes. I won't go on about the joys of digital journalism in detail. Alastair has already mentioned one of my favourite examples, which is The Guardian's Ian Tomlinson case, where a very intrepid hack, Paul Lewis, very traditional hack in many ways, could simply not have done what he did without the contribution from the crowd of citizens. And if you want more examples, go again to my books or my blogs. For me, the new network journalism has some key qualities. It's connected, interactive, and it involves public participation, at least potentially. It combines the functions and values of traditional journalism with the new values such as sharing, openness, transparency, and diversity. And by diversity, I mean in sources and editorial, as well as the people actually doing the thing. And there are loads of good examples connected to mainstream media and plenty more independent ones. These are all creating a new landscape of journalism production. There are new business models and new skill sets, but most importantly, a structural shift that puts the reader at the centre of the process, not at the end. Now, especially in relation to the mediation of power, that does not automatically mean a revolution in mediation, let alone politics. There's still a lot of uncertainty, and some of this is welcome. And here are some of the contradictions or problems around this. One is that as politics becomes more centred around the idea of the authentic, something a word Alastair used earlier, it also becomes ever more managed and dependent on polling and presentation. I think David Cameron embodies this beautifully. As openness becomes more possible, more resource is spent by those in power to try and control things. And perhaps there's a sense that this first phase of digital has already peaked, and we're in a period of consolidation, convergence, and control. Getting full added value out of this new environment in terms of political engagement may mean embracing some of the trends that Alastair has actually criticised. The role of personality or celebrity, for example, can be a good thing. Certainly, it's how more personalised new media works. And boy, does new media work much more successfully when it is trying to engage. We trust information online because it comes from somebody that we are connected to. Lastly, loss of control, which is built into all these systems, these new networks, connectivities and communication. That degree of a loss of control means just that. For Alastair, at his most rational and or committed, that's probably the hardest bit. Because at one end of the spectrum, that does mean Glenn Greenwald and WikiLeaks. And I'd argue that, with those two examples in particular, that they worked best when working with mainstream media, sharing responsibilities as well as the rights that they claim. But they're not always going to do that, and there are going to be new emergent forms of working that will challenge both mainstream media and mainstream politics. It means, for me, accepting that Leveson is last century's solution to last century's problem. It means allowing risks, mistakes, and biases in journalism journalism in this wider sense because the networks are better able to correct them than most state or industry regulators. It means also politics becoming much more open, accountable, and distributed. In the end, people working in networks, I think, will improve journalism and perhaps politics, but you lovely people in Cambridge won't always like it a lot. Alastair won't like a lot of it, and that's great. And because this is a traditional value of journalism, which I think can be reborn, including this network journalism and politics, that it should also be allowed to be partisan, risky, mistaken, and unfair. Thank you.
Right. Where shall I start? Well, I started my response to the first session with a piece of rebuttal. So I'm going to start this one as well. Page 18 of the 43 that made up lecture 2. It could be, of course, that the new media will simply create new oligarchs, less interested in good journalism, which costs money, than in the financial power the platforms and advertising give them. Let's be very wary of billionaire techies thinking that algorithms and blogs are all you need for journalism. Let's see, skeptic note, how Amazon founder Jeff Bezos handles the Washington Post. Let's see if the sense develops that the Facebook-Twitter revolution is really only about the flotations, not a more democratic media. Let's keep an eye on so-called demand media, aka advertorials, gaining hold. And let's be wary of the danger of a new rich-poor divide which further weakens journalism as a pillar of democracy. On the one side, free news in short blasts, on the other, proper journalism reserved for those willing to pay for it. But for now, I concluded, let's be optimistic and try to ensure that social media is a counterweight to oligarchism, not a modern, sexier version. So I don't think we were that far apart, Angela, in relation to how we see the dangers as well as the opportunities for new media and the impact of people like Zuckerberg and Google and Amazon and all the rest of them. I think that I found myself agreeing more with, perhaps I'll agree with the stuff I'll disagree with the stuff that you didn't say, but I found myself agreeing with quite a lot of that. I think that the business about and when you read out the BuzzFeed answer, was that most viewed and most read, or was that their new running order?
There was the running order off the homepage. They do everything on the basis of
what's most, yeah. You see, because I think you can do exactly the same as you did on that exercise with the BBC and Times Online and any of them. There is definitely, and this is back to the public. I'm just observing this rather than criticising the public. I think there is a tendency, and this is a lot of it driven by PR, which is something else I addressed last week. There's a tendency to be driven towards what a media culture defines as the lowest common denominator. So, for example, you and I would probably think that the story that should have excited most interest in those that you read was the bombing in Beirut, but actually it wasn't. And what we all know, if you put when Princess Diana was alive, any paper which put her on the front was going to get a small boost in sales until it became counterproductive, and then they dropped it. David Beckham has gone through similar phases where he's become somebody that adds to sales, and then reaches a saturation point and it goes down again, and then it comes back. My point about the way that social media can change all that is that actually we can all create our own landscape, and I think that's what, to greater and lesser degrees, we're all doing. I find my own media consumption now being driven as much by other people. That's why I think it is to some extent democratising. My interests are out there. I know I'm not a sort of normal person, as Newsnight were very honest enough to tell me I was not seen as a normal person, but my interests are out there, and people engage with me in my media consumption by telling me what they think I'll be interested in. And actually I find that is how I'm now consuming my media. And I also agree with both of you. I've never said that I thought journalism should be fair. I think you should strive at fairness, and it should be, and your opinions should be rooted in accurate reporting. And the great difference I see between the generation that I grew up in, I'm not pretending for 1 minute that it was perfect, but there was an assumption that if I was found to get, or a colleague or I were found to get something really seriously badly wrong, then certainly there'd be an expectation of being disciplined in some way, and if it happened too often, there was an expectation that you'd lose your job. I don't think there's any expectation of that kind of thing in several of our main newspaper groups now, and actually you gave examples in those emails of the opposite being the case, whereas if you don't actually conform to an inaccurate form of journalism as promulgated by the Mail or one of the other behemoths, I think it does actually just mean large, doesn't it? Yeah, so I think that if we are going to change the behaviour, to use your phrase, of the behemoths, I do believe that ultimately there have to be more people like Richard Pepiat who've got you talked about the people in the BBC having the balls to stand up for themselves. I do think individuals have a responsibility to stand up and say, I cannot do this. And I accept, look, I'm well off and I don't have to worry about where my next meal's coming from and all the rest of it. But I could no more work for some of the papers that was now employing people that you've had going through Goldsmiths, and I totally understand why. They want to be journalists, that's a noble thing. They want to have a career, that's a noble thing. But there comes a point where you do have to have a sense of your own morality and whether you can actually do the things that you're being asked to do. And this is a very harsh thing to say, but I do sometimes think that people will be better off leaving places like that, making a song and dance about leaving places like that, and then actually going out into the marketplace and trying to see whether they can find themselves something else. And the other thing that this new media landscape gives people is actually the opportunity it does, and it's happening. Look, I know that she's an exception, but last Friday's Financial Times business life profile, the business life profile of an online magazine editor who's 17 years of age. Now, she's an exception, I accept that. But in my generation, there was no more chance of a 17-year-old getting into the media landscape than flying to the moon. So it is changing. What I think you are rightly arguing for, proper training, and by the way, I would totally support what you said in relation to a sort of, and let me tell you, by the way, all the parties, not just Labour, all of the parties are at that stage in the electoral cycle where they're looking, particularly in these austerity times, for ideas that actually can be seen to generate wealth and jobs and opportunity. And it sounded to me like yours could easily do that. And the point about the need, I said in the first lecture last week, the scale of the media means we need more good journalists, not fewer good journalists. And I totally agree with you, they've got to be trained. They've got to have a training that is focused on the basics of writing, the basics of law, the basics of shorthand. All those things should not be lost simply because we can all walk around with tape recorders and we can record things on our phone. The basics of journalism haven't fundamentally changed. There are too few people, and I think actually another problem that we've got, this whole sort of, people can go straight from, if you're properly connected, whereas Charlie, I don't know, you probably didn't have the connections that I had growing up in being educated in a comprehensive school in Leicester. But the fact is that if you had the connections, you could get into Oxbridge, and likewise, even today in so-called modern meritocratic Britain, if you've got the connections going out of Oxbridge, you can get into the media. Now, that remains the case today, and nothing much has changed. You need proper training. That needs to be challenged as well. And I think that if you could persuade not just the political parties, I think you should be trying to persuade these people that you mentioned to do the levy. They're going to reach a point, these guys. Facebook is a really interesting example of something that didn't exist that long ago. He's 29 years of age, Zuckerberg. He's let's face it, he's a modern kind of legend. To be as successful as he's been, to create something which, if it was a country, would be the third biggest country in the world, that is quite an achievement, okay? Now, as that was happening, he was seen as a phenomenal success story. There comes a point, this has happened to all sorts of behemoths in the world, there comes a point where you're so big, people actually will you to fail rather than will you to succeed. And at that point, you start to look around to do interesting things. And you might find that's the sort of thing you could do without going through the political system. That being said, I think it'd be a very, very good idea for a political party to pick up and run with it. It doesn't cost them money, and it allows them to address serious, significant cultural issues. So I don't know about becoming a champion, if that involves me having to give up too much of my time.
No, we just need your face.
Here it is. You've got it. You've got it. Now, what did I say? Regulated. So I don't agree. You talked about. You seem to think that I want political regulation. I don't. I really don't want that. I do want cultural change, and I think cultural change is driven as much by individuals as it is by regulation. I think the regulation will help. I think independent self-regulation, as set out by Leveson, as evinced by the Royal Charter, would help. But I think that cultural change is better driven by individuals. Totally agree with you about the economics, particularly as they affect local papers. I think that on Charlie's point about the Greenwald and Guardian, New York Times, WikiLeaks, etc. Like I say, I am slightly conflicted in my own mind about this. I can see why I used to get so angry with, and I'll come on to your point about Iraq very shortly. I can see why I used to feel as I did whenever that kind of secret stuff got out into the public domain and journalists used to set themselves up as the arbiter of what was and wasn't secure, what was and wasn't in the public interest. I think that's where there have to be mechanisms, there has to be somewhere within the media political systems, there has to be somewhere where people actually feel they can trust each other to tell the truth to each other in a genuine way. Now, at the moment, I think that's gone. To be fair to Alan Rusbridger, I think he did try to go through the motions. To be fair to the security service, I think they did as well. But I don't think the basic level of trust was there. The security services are sitting there thinking, all I'm doing here in talking to this guy is adding to what he's going to report. And there's some merit of truth in that. All that the journalist is sitting there thinking is, these guys are just trying to stop me what actually I feel I ought to do. And that is a pretty unhealthy environment, and that's why I think we've ended up in a place where neither of them feels that they can have a proper dialogue. Now, I can remember a situation, in fact some of these are in, Charlie plugged his books, in my best-selling diaries, available in all good bookshops. There are a number of instances of situations where, and in fact one of them included Rebecca Wade, Rebecca as she was, Rebecca Brooks as now is, where there's a situation where the Sun got hold of something which the security service was very, 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 very unhappy about them getting hold of. And we got them in, and we had a discussion, and this is, I'm saying nothing here that isn't in black and white in my diaries. We basically had a discussion which ended with them writing a totally different story that was not untrue, but it was not the story that they came in with. And what's more, they knew that in moving from story A to story B, they were helping us out a bit. Now, is that wrong? Is that unethical? I don't know. But it's what happened. And I think my point is, I don't think today there's much chance of that happening. And that's us at the time with the Sun. Would that happen now today with the Guardian or the News International or the Mail if it was a similar situation? I don't think so. And I'm not sure that does any of us any good. Because as I said last week, I think there do have to be systems in government. There are secrecy, it may sound like a bad thing, but at times I think there's a need to accept that it should exist and that there are times when things should be kept secret. And also, I made the point about the trends towards openness and transparency. This is why I do get a little bit pissed off at the way that we're portrayed some of the time by the media in the way that we operate it. You've got to remember, when I was a journalist, I used to troop along to Downing Street and Bernardine would sit there and grump, and you weren't even allowed to ask questions about the security services. You weren't even allowed to say that Bernardingham existed. I can remember my other half, Fiona, who worked on the Daily Express for a while. She wrote a story about Humphrey the cat. Okay, Humphrey the Downing Street cat. She phoned up the press office, and rarely, because normally it would be a sort of junior press officer that was there, she got put through to Bernard. And she quoted Bernard the next day in the paper as a Downing Street spokesman said. He went absolutely berserk, because he wasn't a Downing Street spokesman. He didn't exist. We saw him twice a day, but we could not say that he existed. Now, we put the briefings on the record. Everything I said could be quoted, not attributed by name, but I was the Prime Minister's official spokesperson. Everything was put on the website as soon as it could be transcribed, including questions and all the answers. Anybody could go to it. We opened up the briefings to foreign media and specialist media. Tony Blair became the first Prime Minister who ever did press conferences. David Cameron quietly has shelved that one. People have not noticed that, have they? We used to do a monthly press conference, sort of disappeared, that one. He was the first Prime Minister to go to parliamentary select committees. All of these things were just seen as spin. This was us trying to sort of get control. In fact, this was us trying to communicate and to have a more intelligent dialogue. And Nick Robinson, the BBC, he did a very interesting interview a while back when his book came out, and he said that he said, to be fair to me, he said, to be fair to him, they did try and make all these changes, including the Tony Blair's press conference. He said the problem was, quote, Tony Blair was so good at them they became boring. Now, this takes me back to your objecting to my point that a politician should be able to control what comes out of his mouth. Tony Blair stands at a lectern. They can ask whatever they want. They can ask it till they're blue in the face. And he never left those press conferences until they all had their little say. He is responsible for what he says. Now, what Nick Robinson is saying in that quote is that unless he screws up under their persistent and highly intelligent questioning, it's not news. And the definition of news is therefore, it has to be, he screwed up, he said something he doesn't want to say, or he said something different the last time, and we've got that on our database, and we can say this is a U-turn, or it's a split, or it's a gaffe, and all, one of the other cliches that goes along. So I think it all comes back to this central point I keep making: there's got to be a more mature acceptance of both sides having a legitimate and very different job. Just very, very briefly, I won't drone on about Iraq, but it's interesting to see. We're all of us meant to be interested in facts and accuracy, and you said that the BBC story turned out, quotes, to be true. And it didn't, because the story was not about the existence of weapons of mass destruction. The story was that we, and specifically when he came to being paid a few bob by the Mail on Sunday, I had put into that dossier intelligence which we knew to be untrue, against the wishes of the intelligence agencies. That is a very different thing. And that is why we took it so seriously. And back to my point about dealing with the BBC, because we made the complaint, this is what emerged at the Hutton inquiry, we're there thinking that we're a behemoth, they're a behemoth, and they'll be doing what we're doing, which is getting to the truth. Because we were sort of saying, right, let's get all the emails, let's get all the papers out, let's get everything out so we can actually see what they're, why they've said what they've said. They actually, we discovered, didn't do any of that. They basically said Downing Street have complained, therefore we have to defend it. And it all flowed from that. So the story was wrong. And it was, it's to this day I can't see why they couldn't see that you cannot accuse, you cannot make that level of accusation without more evidence than that utterly disreputable creep who's now the cycling commissioner to the Mayor of London. Baffling, without having some more than he had to substantiate it. So it was not true. Is there any point I didn't address?
I think we should give you both a chance to respond to his points, if you wish to.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to get into what he said, she said about the Hutton inquiry far too long. So you win on that one, but I think they said it was sexed up, which isn't quite the same.
No, well, that's what happens with headlines. Is you get into a short term, but that's what I mean. The accusation was a little bit more than that. On
that very early report, before 6 o'clock in the morning.
No, it wasn't. It was at 6. You're not going to win on this. It was at 6:07.
Oh, 6:07.
And the next day, it led virtually every major media organisation in the world. Doesn't matter. The next day, it led virtually every news bulletin the day. No, they didn't lead on me until the Sunday.
Well, I mean, this is the issue, really. I mean,
read the website. You said go to the Leveson. Was it you who said, or you said yeah? Go to that.
The question, this is part of what I was saying about the new media, which is to me more important. I know that what Charlie is saying is that basically we're all being, my position is elitist, in that what I'm saying is that perhaps BuzzFeed, with its headline, isn't the way to go. But I think what we're looking at is something that's rather more complicated than that. And it is the way in which algorithms work online.
I agree.
To divert everybody to the same things. And what we're seeing more and more and more is that, you know, the very, very popular will get the money and will survive, and other things won't. And it is finding the other things that are really important. Secondly, the question you said about people finding stuff on social media. That's also really interesting and useful to a certain extent. Indeed, we're just about to launch some research looking at the way in which students use news, because I don't know if you've read Paris's book about what I call the Hall of Mirrors effect, but there is a real worry that people are only reading stuff that's passed to them by their mates, and they're getting a very weird idea of what's important in the world. So we need to understand in much finer detail what's really happening in terms of the internet and democracy. I think that there's an awful lot that's been said, which is optimistic because it's based on hope rather than based on research. And the thing about Richard Peppier, I've got a lot of time for Richard Peppier. I think he was very brave. He will never work in a newspaper again. And that's what he sacrificed. And I think we have to keep that in mind. It's a hell of a sacrifice to say, I am kissing goodbye to my career. I mean, partly because he was so public about it. But if you're not public about it, you change nothing. If you are public about it, you sacrifice everything. Unless you're David Lee, who's the Guardian.
But he's got a new career.
Well,
and I think he's got a better career.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed for him. I really hope he has a new career.
What? No. You see,
give him a job. I'd say. I think
I might be. I'm off paper that I run.
I think he really needs the people who think he's done a wonderful thing to, in a sense, put their money where their mouth is. I think he's actually having a hard time.
Okay. I didn't know that because I've seen him on the telly a bit. I do think though that the fact that we can only really think of him shows what a fairly unbrave. I mean, they go on about they're seeking after truth and they'll do anything to the story and all the rest of it. But actually, if one of the purposes of going into journalism is because you sort of believe in truth and democracy and exposing wrongdoing and all the rest of it, when it's happening inside your own, in front of you, I think there comes a point where people have a responsibility to recognise that.
There is another responsibility, and that is responsibility to create some kind of framework. It's a public responsibility.
Yes, it may be, but ultimately,
it's more the responsibility of the individual.
No, I'm not. I don't disagree with that, but I think that when we say it's a public responsibility and we say politics has to sort it out or the media owners have to sort it out, well, fine, and we'll wait forever. My point is change does tend to come when individuals make change happen and they decide to make change. I mean, I'm in discussion with this person I mentioned who works at Mail Online. And I've said, look, fine, and they get, I think they get 110, 120 quid a shift. Okay, right. Well, I reckon if if we got together and put a little plan together, I think we could cause a lot of damage and hopefully act as a platform to a future career. But I understand the risks. I do understand the risks.
But couldn't you say exactly more or less the same things about Edward Snowden?
No. Yes, you could say the same things. Yeah. I do think that's slightly different. I mean, he's not a journalist.
No, he's not, but you were talking about the importance of individuals.
Yeah, you could. No, you could. I see on that, yes, you could. You could say the same thing, yeah. If I don't know the guy, if his motivation was a genuine belief that what was going on was wrong, and the only way to expose that was to expose it, and that would lead to change, yeah. But I think the way it was done, I do think the newspapers dealt with it responsibly once it landed on it. And this is the one thing that I really thought when I was thinking about this, is that if I'd have been a journalist, my instinct would have been, how can I get as much of this into the public domain as possible? Totally. I mean, I don't know the guy, so I don't know what his motivations were, but if the motivations were to expose what he saw as wrongdoing as a way of stopping it happening, then yeah, the parallel's accurate, yeah.
going to open up to questions now. I think you have one.
Yeah, I just want to talk about diversity in the media. The media as a whole, and this is for all of you, the media as a whole preaches that we should have more diversity in public life. And yet, not very many journalists are diverse. The most famous ones are white, middle class, male, and also without a disability. I just want to ask you, why should the media kind of practice what it's preaching and get a more diverse area of journalism?
Well, the only thing is I think it does practice what it preaches, because there's one thing that the large parts of the media hate, it's any sort of diversity. They want conformity to a very narrow set of views and values. So I think on that you couldn't necessarily accuse them of hypocrisy, you can just accuse them of being wrong.
Well said there.
I would add to that if newspapers pay so little, it's very hard for working class people to become journalists because they need to have enough money to live on. And the vast majority of black people in this country are actually working class. So it's a class issue as much as it is a race issue, and it's about money.
Sorry.
On that theme, it's about money. We've got a press which is basically seeing its revenue evaporate. We have papers like The Guardian losing £30 million a year. I don't really see in that sort of environment, first of all, how one can expect to be paying people more. And secondly, how we can really expect to see diversity in ownership, because the only people who can afford to own papers are people who are extremely rich. Lebedev, for example, says he cannot afford to go on owning The Independent, and he's a Russian oligarch. But that's why the takeovers happen without any reference, is because the only person willing to buy is the only person who will save the paper.
Yeah, that is true. That is a sad truth.
What about Denmark, though? There's only 5 million Danes, so how do they do it?
How do they do what?
More than
Press, how do they do that?
They subsidise press. I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, it comes back to what you were saying, that in Scandinavia has a thriving, much more diverse press because it's subsidised.
Well, should we do that? National
I think it's a jolly good idea. We have to find a way of
But
doing
that
it.
used to happen with local papers. I mean, part of the reason the local papers were able to survive was the local adverts were put in by councils. Councils are being squeezed on their budgets, so they put it online, they publish it on their own website. Pickles tries to stop them publishing their own newspapers. So it means that local newspapers, a big chunk of their revenue was from the local council. That simply doesn't exist.
Alastair, how would you advise a politician who was about to bring in a new tax to subsidise newspapers?
You tax Google and you create a public fund, a public trust fund that you can then...
Google will just say, right, I'm not carrying any more news on that.
No, not necessarily at all. What's happened in France?
In France and Britain and Belgium, they've had the courage to do it. They haven't got very far, but they got
I think you probably would be looking at only being able to do it at a European level. No, I think when you say though, how would you advise a politician to do it? I think that back to the point about the BBC is actually a very popular institution, despite making serious errors in its coverage of the Iraq War. So it is a very popular institution. So if you were able to make the link between the BBC and that model of journalism and local papers, I could easily put together a case to a politician that went out and made that case. It does, and so what you'd be arguing for is something modelled on the BBC at a local level so that we can have better informed public debate. I think you can make it in the argument.
So what you're arguing for is what the Conservative government pushed through in the last licence review, which was a top slicing to pay for a local television station.
And I'm talking about newspapers here. And I agree with you, but the reason why local newspapers are in trouble is because those who own them see them purely as something that they want to get a profit out of. And actually there's lots of local newspapers that are making a profit but are sacking people left, right and centre. And you're right that there was a sort of an understanding that local newspapers were funded by councils putting all their necessary advertising in those papers, and now they can do it for free. And the same newspapers which have A lot of them, their editorial model has been to savage the local council, because that's what you do, because you're trying to sort of ape the national papers and what they do. They suddenly found lots of local councils around the world saying, well, you know, why should we fund you that all you're doing basically is trying to kill us and we can now do it for nothing? We can put this stuff online. So that is, again, if you'd had a situation there where local government could talk to local newspaper and have an honest debate about their need for some sort of sensible mutual coexistence, they wouldn't be in the mess they're in.
Cosy.
Yeah, sordid entanglements. Could be a novel, that.
I'd like to come
Great
back
title.
to this issue of class. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally American. I live in Kenya now, but I've been here living in Britain since April. And the thing that's really surprised me as I started to read the British newspapers regularly was how there were these really wonderful papers like the FT and the Guardian, and then these real crap papers like the Daily Mail.
That the people read.
Well, that's what I'm coming to. And I've been thinking a lot about why that's so, and something very recently sort of crystallized it, that whole discussion about Ed Miliband and his father. I talked to a number of people here in Cambridge and elsewhere. I was so shocked by it. I was totally shocked. And the people that I talked to, I imagine 80% of them read The Guardian, sort of just kind of laughed it off. It's like, that's what they do, the Daily Mail and whatever. And I thought to myself, this is a very elitist thing, not to care that these kind of things happen. And I'm wondering whether there's a big issue of class here, that the elite class in Britain just doesn't really care about whether newspapers or news organizations are really serving the public or doing any good, because just give the plebs what they want, and the rest of us will read the FT and the Guardian.
That is a very interesting observation. I wonder if it's less about not caring than a sort of feeling that there's a total lack of insight as to what you can do. Because most people, actually I think most people, elite or non-elite, do believe in a free press. And that includes the freedom to be... You don't think it's true?
No, I think the evidence is that people, we do some polling on nursing, for example. There's a huge enthusiasm for regulation, from everything from gas prices.
To ensure a free press.
No, it's not.
Oh, it is, Charlie. It is.
I know it is
The
that.
enthusiasm around this table isn't for a free press, it's for a press that's no longer called reviews.
I don't agree with that.
I completely disagree with that.
I don't agree with that. But what about this point, though, about the whether... I think there is... What I think has happened is a sort of a kind of passive acceptance. I don't think it's a class thing necessarily, but it's like... I mean, I'm one of the very, very, very small number of people in the political world, for example, who says any of this. And because people fear there's a danger that if you say the Daily Mail is a terrible thing, that you're attacking their readers. Well, partly I am. But people in politics and people in media, that's a very, very difficult thing to do, because you're talking about, you know, a very, very, very large number of people. I mean, I don't know if you were there last week, but I was describing some of the very childish things that I do in my part of my one-man jihad against the Daily Mail, including ripping it up if I see it in a public place, refusing to get into a taxi if the driver has it, and I actually say, if you can either have me in the taxi or the Mail, you can't have both. Makes me happy, makes me feel better. 8 out of 10 taxi drivers agree to drive to a bin. They prefer to have the fare than have the Mail. But then I'll see the same taxi driver, Addison. I've got this guy who lives near me, an Addison Lee driver, and it's become a joke now. He always has it on the front of the passenger seat, knowing that I'll say I have to throw it away, but I also know that he'll have it the next time I see him. But bit by bit I can persuade him. But I think it's a very... The great thing about that question is I don't know how to answer it.
Well, can I follow up on that? I grew up, shock horror, in the Daily Mail and Daily Express reading household. I have adopted different political views as I came to independence. My mother still reads those papers. I wouldn't dream of telling her that she was lowering herself or somehow not doing herself justice by reading them. I think the people who are in this space and who are able to engage in this kind of dialogue about the press and the role it performs are absolutely getting ideas above their station if they seek to censor what other people are reading, regardless of whether you think there's merit in it or not.
I really want to come back on that because I think it's a complete misunderstanding of the situation. No, you're whispering in my ear.
muttering loudly.
As far as I'm concerned, I do not agree with the Daily Mail's politics or the Sun's politics. That is absolutely not the point. What I think is bad about what's happening in the popular press at the moment, and goes up and down according to the kind of sense of horror that people display about them, is the idea that using the lives of ordinary people as though they were inanimate objects is okay. Now, when I'm talking about ethics, I'm not talking about politics. I think, the Daily Mail has every right to say whatever it wanted about Blair. It's a right-wing newspaper, we know it is. I don't want the Daily Mail not to exist. I'd like to live in a country where nobody wanted it, but that isn't the case. The fact is that the Daily Mail exists because people have politics like that. Where it steps over the line, and where in particular the Sun has stepped over the line, and the Express steps over the line, in thinking that it's okay to serve up the lives of people as though they were simply characters in a story who had no rights of their own. I think that's what ethical judgment should be about. Ethical judgment is about, is it in the public interest to put a huge picture across the front of the newspaper about a woman who had, and there's a whole lot of them. They all came up in Leveson, but one of the ones that I particularly enjoy is the one of a woman who had breast enhancement surgery and has been used time and time again. She was somebody who was on benefits. She's been used time and time again as evidence of the iniquity of the whole class of people who are on benefits. What about the people who are served up probably having no idea what was happening to them, where you get a family who happen to be in a house in an area of London that is expensive, and because of the way the Tory government, followed by the Labour Party, have organised housing benefit, they happen to be getting a very high level of housing benefit in order to live at all. And they're simply served up as fodder, without any consideration at all about the fact that they are people with lives, this is the circumstances in which they live, and they are used as kind of moral tale in order to outrage people about the dreadful and iniquitous misuse of the benefit system and our taxes. Now, politics, I expect the Daily Mail to be right-wing, I expect the Sun to be right-wing, and you decide to read it or you don't. But I think when newspapers actually reduce the lives of ordinary human beings in that way, they should be answerable to something, somebody, some kind of body, some kind of sense of their own ethics, for your sake. That's where I think the line should be drawn. Sorry, that went on far too long.
Natalie, do you want to react to this as well?
I wanted to respond to that question just because I've been greatly encouraged, actually, since the whole Leveson inquiry began, that I think people are now much more ready to stand up and shout foul when exactly these sorts of instances take place. And I think in the past, you're right, it was just oh well, that's just the way it is, that's what the tabloid press is. I think because people now see that there's a chance that maybe, just something might happen that will change this situation, that maybe there are people who think the same as them, that we're seeing much more response in relation to those instances of misrepresentation or other issues of press abuse, and I think that's a really positive thing. But I was really, I'm really taken by your return, Alastair, constantly to this idea of growing up a bit and getting a mature acceptance. And I wonder whether it's, to me, what that means is actually restating the link between media and democracy, and news and democracy, much more readily. So it's not just about growing up, it's actually about saying this is what the news should be doing, as well as all the other stuff. It's not just about that. Actually, there's a very real relationship with democracy. Once we recognise that, once we're prepared to talk about it, then all sorts of other things flow from it, such as the concentration of ownership, such as funding models, such as how we deal with it ethically. So, but I think we've got to start talking about it in those terms
I agree with
rather than assuming that all it is about this thing called freedom, which ends up giving more power to the powerful.
Yeah, agree with that.
Sorry, what comment?
Yeah, surely the point about the Daily Mail is that it's a newspaper that uniquely panders to every visceral prejudice in town. And that is a very good reason for unsubscribing from it if you do subscribe to it, which is exactly what my college has just done. And it did it specifically in connection with the coverage of Miliband's father, because the terms of that coverage were not just attempt to smear a dead man, but to smear him on the theme of not really one of us. And that to me crosses the line. But Alistair, I would like to take you back to something you said earlier, and it concerns the period in Europe, the interface of government, security and journalism. The story you told me, you called in the editors of The Sun with, I presume, some representatives of the security services present and persuaded them to rewrite a story. So instead of publishing story A, they published story B. And when you, your conclusion of that particular narrative, you then reflected, well, was that ethical or unethical? And you then went on to say that you didn't know. Now this could be read as an attempt to trip you up, in some ways perhaps it is, but here's my response to that. If you can't answer that question, are you in a position to answer any of the big questions that you've been addressing here today? Yes. Why is it that you are able, in retrospect, to say, now that was okay, no, it wasn't okay. What you said instead is, I don't know.
No, but I was speaking there about I was asking about the ethics. I felt totally comfortable with what I was doing. I was asking whether the journalists were behaving journalistically in an ethical way. And that's what I don't know. I can give you their names. One of them is very busy at the moment, defending herself.
You mentioned it, you said Rebecca.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And the other one was Trevor Kavanagh, I think it was. No, I'm genuine.
Sorry, do you mean they were present to publish a story that wasn't true?
No. They were publishing a story that was true, but it was not the story that they wanted to publish.
I completely misunderstood.
Sorry, well, in which case I didn't explain it very well. They published a story that was true, but it was not the story that they had. I was entirely...
The story that they had true?
Yes.
It was a different kind of true.
Yes, it was a different story.
The point is that, I think, Chris, the point is that the ethics were on the side, the question of the ethics was on the side of the journalists, not the side of the government. No, there was a little bit. I was trying to persuade them openly and honestly and straightforwardly not to write something. Yeah. And the only way we could do that was actually, in a sense, to get them to write something else. Yeah.
Well, so you shot somebody?
No, nobody got shot, nobody got harmed, nobody got damaged. It was a different story. It was a different story. They came into the building with one story and left the building with another story, and they seemed quite happy.
Well, you did a jolly good job, and that's a job you were meant to be doing, defending the government.
Can I just come back to the Mail, by the way? Because I do think that the reason why I think it's important that the reader of the newspaper looks at their own role and responsibility within it is because what a particular paper says about what sort of country we're in. And the fact is, I mean, their own coverage of so many issues is fundamentally dishonest. And I meet people the whole time, and this isn't just about the Mail, but right across, but the Mail is the worst offender, I think, where people believe what is in that newspaper. And it informs their view of the world, and it informs what happens around them. So, for example, let's take the debate about immigration in Britain, or let's take the debate about Europe. We have fundamentally skewed opinion, largely skewed by newspapers which lie. Now, if they want to read that and dismiss it, fine. If they want to read it, but it then informs their opinion, which then may inform their opinion, say, in a referendum on the future of Britain's membership of the European Union, I think that becomes less fine.
So
saying earlier about in a pluralistic media environment, people will find their ways to good, trustable sources because the popular wisdom will...
Yeah, they may do. But my point is that, for example, you take the debate about Europe, I don't think we would even be having this debate about a referendum if it hadn't been for several decades of sustained lying about Europe in our papers.
So you think that's coming from the press rather than from the politicians?
I do, yeah. No, I do. I think the politicians in this case have totally responded. I don't think David Cameron wants to be in this position. I think he's responded to a 3-decade-long campaign of misrepresentation, which has been very successfully exploited by Nigel Farage, and he's given David Cameron a big political problem. I do, yeah.
Now, if you don't mind me intervening now, we're very pressed for time, and I'm sorry to say we've got about 5 minutes to go, and I see there's at least 5 questions in the audience.
Right, we'll all be brief.
So if you don't mind, if we can make those questions very brief, and if you want to, if you really have a question, can you please make your question very brief, and then we'll take maybe 3, and then you'll respond to them, and then we'll close the debate. Does this sound fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sarah.
I was struck by Angela's opening reading of 2 emails, which made me very sad, about people who are in the workplace in the media sector who were being kicked around by their bosses and forced to do things that they didn't want to do. But I've worked in the media, and I've worked in the corporate sector, and I've worked in the NGO sector, and I have left 2 or 3 jobs in my time, and I've ended up being very successful as an entrepreneur and as a freelance, because I think that's normal. I mean, my question, if I have to put it as a question, is, do the media have to follow better, more ethical standards than any other economic sector on this earth? Because if not, then what your 2 people experience is exactly what they're experiencing in other sectors in the economy.
You had a question as well? Please make it very brief.
Yes, I'll try. I have a question that refers to something you called the Kosovo War and the intervention. But I want to ask you about your role in it, because you already said you don't regret much, and I spent most of my academic career researching what you did, and
That's volume 2.
But I have a question about the journalists, and I'm sure you know that the international correspondents have come out and said that they were manipulated and lied to by actors on the ground, not just by their governments. Do you think that they did a good job as journalists?
The journalists? Covering Kosovo,
And
okay.
sorry, there's another question here, please very brief as well.
Getting back to your idea about citizenship, I sat the Life in the UK test, and to my great delight found that essentially the criteria for being British was that you failed the multi-choice question book when I took that to morning and afternoon tea. Coming from a left-wing background, we do have this aversion to the ideas of citizenship and so on. How do you respond from the left to the idea of the responsible citizen and their place in society and engagement with the media?
I'm big on citizenship. I don't see why it's seen as left or right. I'll tell you why where the fear of it comes, is the right-wing misrepresentation of a belief in citizenship as somehow sort of, wanting Mao Zedong style cultural brainwashing and all the rest of it. The minute you suggest, for example, you teach kids about politics in schools, you'll have your mum and dad reading about, Miliband wants to brainwash your kids. Whereas in fact, what he might want to do genuinely is promote better citizenship and better understanding of political and public debate. I think on Kosovo, did they do a good job? Well, it depends who they are. What I think, Kosovo was a very, very difficult conflict to cover because it was happening with, this is why we should be very, very wary of any genuine state control of the media, which Leveson doesn't remotely propose, and nor does the Royal Charter. Where Milosevic had state control of the media, that gave him huge influence over the media that was based there, that lived there, but it also gave him huge influence over what you might call our media as well, because they were totally dependent. Their main source, they didn't like to admit it, but their main source was the media that was covering Kosovo in Kosovo. Totally state controlled.
And also the international correspondents have come out and say they were manipulated by the other side as well.
By us?
No, but by the Kosovo.
Yeah, but they didn't want to say that at the time. They didn't want to say that at the time. They wanted...
Following up with what you said state. I've never seen you comment on basically bombing a media outlet.
I've commented on that before. I've written about that in volume 2 of the diaries.
So your answer is by volume 2.
Well, listen, wait a minute, buy all of them, but if she's studied, if you've spent your whole life studying it, you must... Yeah, okay. But no, the point about that was that that was a really difficult thing, because there were situations where, Milosevic used what he would refer to as his media as an instrument of his military strategy. Now, does that make it a legitimate military target? I think it might. Now, the problem, and this is something that he did, because of the technology required, there are limited places that Western media could actually broadcast from. One, they were under control. Two, they literally had people around them from the regime, and there were very few places from which they could broadcast. Obviously, some of those places were the state-controlled media headquarters. So that meant that when NATO was launching military strikes at those, there was a risk that you were going to kill British, American, French, German, Italian journalists. That is true.
The last question that was raised, do you want to address it briefly?
It was...
Is the media any different from...
No, the answer is no. The answer is no. The question is whether it behaves worse than other sectors. I think it probably does. I don't think it has much... for example, and if you look at a paper like The Mail's attitude, say, to disability or to benefits, why should you think that somebody who's got disabilities or is going to rely on benefits within that sector is going to get fair treatment? So I think actually, of course there are sectors that are going to be worse, and it's part of the job of the media organisations to expose it. But I don't think they should be better. I think they should certainly work within the law. They should be fair to their employees, and I don't think they are.
And I think we should close on this note. And what I'd like to do now very briefly is thank again the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Blavatnik Family Foundation for their support of the lectures and of the symposium. Thank CRASSH for their relentless help in organising those events. Absolutely. And thank you all for coming and for your questions during the symposium. And more importantly, thank our 4 speakers, Natalie Fenton, Aeron Davis, Angela Phillips, and Charlie Beckett, 4 behemoths of intellectual thinking.